My name's Jim Mitchell. I'm a visual effects supervisor on the new Jurassic Park 3 movie, and basically I've been working on it about a year. We started talking with Joe Johnston, the director, and meeting with Larry Franco, the producer, as to what this new dinosaur movie was going to be about. Started last, I think it was July, and went in from talking over the scripts and the storyboards to going on location to Hawaii and doing a lot of work on the Universal set down in LA, and came back here back in January and have been going nonstop and putting all the computer generated effects into the movie. We've got a bunch of new creatures in the way of the pteranodons, the Spinosaurus, the ankylosauruses. And what's really fun is the different locations he's taking you to on the island. It's not just the jungles and all that. We've got this huge sequence that takes place in what's known as the Aviary Canyon, where the pteranodons are supposed to be like their bird cage, but obviously the size of a canyon to hold these 30-foot wingspan pteranodons in. So that's going to be an exciting sequence. It's very important that we get involved from day one. We're talking 400 shots that have to go into this movie, and it's very critical how we integrate them into the story. So we get involved from day one with the director as to how we're going to shoot things, working with a director of photography. And even though there's the animatronic dinosaurs from Stan, a lot of what happens there is we still get involved with how we're going to either put additional dinosaurs into the shot, and since they do a lot of puppetry type of work, that we may have to remove the rods that they're using to manipulate the creatures, or even some of the shots where we were using Stan Winston Spinosaurus foot, but then we were adding the rest of the body to the creatures, which is sort of a new thing for us, really integrating pieces of Stan's dinosaurs with our dinosaurs. So that was quite interesting.
It was interesting in Jurassic Park 3 that we did have returning dinosaurs, the T-Rex, and we had new dinosaurs. The returning characters, we wanted to stay true to those characters because we felt they have been established. The way they walk has been established in the other ones. We wanted to take maybe T-Rex a little further, give him a little higher energy level than maybe he had in the past, but still stay true to that walk and that behavior that had already been established, so that the Jurassic Park T-Rex is the Jurassic Park T-Rex. With Spino, we had the opportunity to explore, new avenues with him. It was fun in that anytime you get a new character like that, you take a look at the character and you do all the studies of form follows function, where can we take this guy? He sort of reminded us kind of a crocodile, he's got the longer snout, the longer neck. And Joe always said, Spino's not real bright. He's not as smart as T-Rex. He's kind of a big, dumb oaf, but still something you wouldn't want to mess with. So that's sort of where we started with Spino. And then there was, how fast can we make Spinosaurus run? According to Jack Horner, our paleontological consultant on this show, he was telling us that Spino was built for running more than T-Rex. So we went through a lot of various versions of how fast to have him run. We had him up to, I think, 37 miles an hour at one point. And I think we settled somewhere in around 26, 27 was kind of the speed that we liked for him. But we always thought that when he was on the rampage, he was like this lethal freight train just blowing through the jungles and stuff. With the pteranodons, we had the challenge of trying to figure out how they'd fly in open canyons and in confined areas. And we know, again, talking to Jack and some of the paleontologists here at Berkeley, that they were mainly gliders. They rode the wind currents. They didn't do a lot of powered flight. The nearest existing animal today that they could compare it to would probably be the albatross, which is a very stiff-winged bird that rides the ocean currents. We knew in this movie there were times when we were in very confined areas, and Joe wanted to see him a lot more energetic. So we sort of got into a little bit of a bat flight in places, and then at other times they would fly more like the albatross. Their wing configuration is completely different than a bat's, but we did do a lot of powered flight in confined areas that is a lot more akin to the way a bat flies than a pteranodon would have. They were a returning character, so we wanted everybody to believe that, these are the Jurassic Park raptors. And through the other movies, they started to establish the idea of intelligence, and we just sort of took that up another notch here. It allowed us to play with contrasts, I think, in the raptors, unlike you've seen in any of the other movies. And by that, I mean, when they're intelligent, there's quieter moments with them, and a lot of it is just conveyed through, like little head turns. Like when you watch birds and they just do that little head move that they'll do. That sort of thing would convey a thought process going on. So there was times when we could pull them back and be real subtle, so you would sort of feel the thought process at work. But then on the same hand, when they were out in the open tearing after would-be victims and stuff, we got to show them running almost 45 miles an hour, which is something you've never seen before. In fact, I remember in the first movie, there was a line in there where one of the characters, they asked him how fast they could go, and he said, you know, cheetah speed, 50, 60 miles an hour, if they ever got out into the open. In this one, you actually get to see these things, you know, tearing across open fields in a real high energy. The process of putting computer-generated dinosaurs on the screen starts with the tactile art of sculpture. Maquettes will be made with clay. They'll be sculpted, they'll be refined. That's actually where the design phase of the dinosaur takes place. Once those sculptures and maquettes are done, we get them here at ILM. We scan those sculptures, and then from the scanned data, we can go into the computer and rebuild them to match the sculptures, the same sculptures that, you know, Stan Winston is using at his end. That way there's a tie-in between the animatronic and the computer-generated dinosaurs. Once the geometry or the outer surface is created, we have to introduce all the animation controls into that geometry, into that outer surface, so the animators can get in there and manipulate it, and can move it, can animate it.
There's also much work that gets done from our rotoscoping painting artists, where they have to articulate leaves and branches and trees that the Spinosaurus, for example, might be coming from behind. We have tons of effects animators. They're either kicking up sand or doing leaves or knocking over trees or having the Spinosaur break through a computer-generated fence. And then the compositors who have to take all those elements and make them look like those computer-generated images belong in the real live action plates. What you see sometimes is 30 frames up on the screen is taking us 5 or 6 weeks. It's a huge process, but it requires amazing talents.
I'm a model supervisor on Jurassic Park 3, and what I have to do other than building the new dinosaurs that come up and get some of the old dinosaurs that we already have ready to go is kind of oversee what happens to them for the rest of the show. Once they go into the other processes after they're built, somebody has to kind of keep a look and make sure that our sculpts are maintaining all the integrity that we tried to put into them up front. We sculpt all these muscles and bones and everything in the surface for a reason, and you have to kind of keep an eye on it because there's so many people down the pipeline using them. We have to make sure that our sculpts throughout the show and throughout all the range of motion are holding up and still looking like dinosaurs are supposed to look. Right now, looking at this same model, you can see it shaded, you can see it as a wireframe render, or you can see it just as a series of points in space. It's the same geometry. When we're building with it, we're working almost like you're sculpting with wire is how I think of it. It's kind of like cutting clothing patterns out of wire. It doesn't receive paint, it doesn't receive anything else except it basically gives you a silhouette, and that's what the animators work with. And if you want to compare one of those models, like to this is the high-res detail model that gets rendered and gets all the textures applied to it. Now the painters and envelopers and everyone but the animators do work with the high-res geometry because their stuff's also high-res rendered on the screen. It's just that the animation model has to be much lighter for it to be manipulated easily and quickly in the computer. Otherwise the stuff would take even longer than it does.
This is DF-10A. This is a shot of Spino battling the Tyrannosaur. And basically, they just set up a camera on the set and just moved it back and forth. So it was up to us to sort of figure out what exactly they're going to be doing in that shot. In one of the paleontology books I read, they talked about you can only imagine, what it would be like to have two giant 8-ton theropods battling each other. Well, we had to imagine it. So we had to try and figure out what that action would be. So a lot of it came, ideas from the other animators, ideas from Dan Taylor, ideas from Joe Johnston, and also just going in there, just sort of trying to plan out what they might do when they're fighting each other. So there's a headbutt, and there's a scratch, and there's a grab, and then he lunges in and he scratches him. And all of this is still very rough animation, but it'll be done in 12 days, hopefully. So, and then that's when they can get to work on the skin simulations to make all the skin jiggle, and that's sort of like you'd see on an elephant. So, and that'll make it feel that much more real. And this is even before they've added dust and leaves and camera shake and all those things added together. I think it'll look really great.
animators working on these pteranodons, I salute them because this guy is a handful. The wings themselves, they might as well be separate creatures. They're that convoluted and complicated, and we'll try to work with as low res of a model as we can afford and still get the manipulation we need. You can manipulate parts of the model depending on what you need to do. It's kind of akin to the old stop motion creatures and doing that sort of puppetry, in that there's basically that you've got an armature. It's a mathematical armature, not made of steel, but it's the same thing in principle. And you manipulate the puppet pose to pose to pose through the frames, and generally you'll work end to end, tweaking as you go, and you'll wind up at the final render stage.
This shot in the movie is called ER9, and this right here is just a paper mache version. And all we're doing when we're doing this is making sure that the movements, the cadences of movement, the rhythms of movement are correct. And we'll get this in front of Joe and making sure that the performance is what he wants. And this has been through a lot of different versions. Joe wanted the walk to be slow and sinister. He didn't want it to be fast. There's an aspect of the raptors, of an animal that big and menacing coming up to you really slowly, that's very creepy. Another aspect that we also added, and you can see it even in this version, there are a lot of bird-like ticks that we've added to the animal's movements, and that lends a believability to the creatures, because birds of prey, when they're focused on prey, there's these little corrective movements that they do with their heads, and we thought that was a really neat thing that would lend a lot of believability to the raptor. It makes them feel more like animals instead of monsters, and if you believe that they're real, it puts the audience more in the movie.
In dynamic skin simulation, what we're trying to do is bring the creatures closer to reality. If you go out and you look at large creatures moving in a natural environment, there's thousands of things going on with their skin and their musculature and their bones as they move through their environment. What we want to do is get closer to that. So what we want to do is create the effect that there is a bone moving under the skin, and that's driving muscles, and the muscles have their own set of dynamics. And those dynamics in turn drive the skin so that it stretches and folds and moves around correctly. If the Spinosaurus puts his foot down hard on the ground, there should be a reverberation of that in the skin. The muscle should flex, the skin should react to that flexing and shake as well.
Nobody move a muscle.
There's a shot called DF1, which was the first Tyrannosaurus shot that we did muscle development on. The kind of things we added is there's jiggle in the neck, you can see. There's muscle flex, there's ribs kind of sliding under the skin. The first step is we get animation from the animator, and this is kind of how it comes to us from the animator. It's just basic motion, and then it comes to our group, the muscle and flesh group, to have all the extra stuff added. The first thing we do is to add what we're calling muscle rigs, muscle and jiggle rigs, so that each muscle has its own bit of wiggliness and wobbliness to it. The next step is the muscles themselves are enveloped so that instead of being little hard bones and things, they look more like soft, sort of flabby muscles. You can see that they've got a bit of wiggle and jiggle to them. One of the really good advancements on the show is that we've been able to use proprietary technology to build virtual computer graphics flesh and skin. This sort of facety looking stuff you see here is the CG flesh and skin. That's kind of laid over the musculature, and the muscle sort of pushes it out so that you can see kind of the muscle sliding around underneath it. So you end up with an effect of muscles and bones sliding around underneath the skin. At that point, it gets handed off to the technical director, and wondrous rendering and shading occurs, and you end up with the final product.
I'm the compositing supervisor. That means that I have a crew of, it varies 8 to 10 compositors right now, and I go around and we basically get all the shots that are assigned to us. We're responsible for color correction, compositing all the elements that the TDs render. We're pretty much the person at the end of the shot that takes all the elements, whether they be shot practically or not, put them all together, and are responsible for the finished product, polishing them off. My job is to oversee all those shots and the people that do them. So we start with this shot, and we have to match it exactly, including elements like fog that weren't shot in the other plates, and then any kind of matting that will allow us to put the rendered elements into the shot. So we start with a background plate. We have to put our pteranodon roughly here, so we start with mats rendered out to create shadows. These shadows are created roughly by a mat based on the geometry of the pteranodon. Next step would be an atmospheric that would be behind the pteranodon. In this case, it's a rendered fog element. The next step is to deal with any kind of matting that we need in order to put Sam back over. This is done by our rotoscope department. So now where it's white, Sam Neill will get put back into the shot. All this will be background plate. Wherever there's black, we'll show the background image. So the next step is we get a rendered pteranodon. So now he looks a little bit more like he fits the scene. This involves color correction, some hazing, putting some of the atmosphere around him that's actually in the plate. The next step would be a fog layer that just adds to the atmosphere of the shot. And the next step is to put Sam Neill back in. And again, the last step is another level of an atmospheric haze. So we've built from back to front. We've definitely taken our cues from the plate and come forward with different atmospheric cues and hazing and focus blur. And his mats need to be finessed so he looks more natural. And that would be one of our more complex yet straightforward compositing shots.